Michael Crichton once said, if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it is a part of a tree. Keep this in mind as we discuss today with one of our guests the meaning of the new global order and what does it mean for us all. My name is Dr. David Oualaalou.
And my name is Dr. Ross Stewart.
And you are watching Geopolitics in Conflict.
Dr. McCoy, we are delighted to have you with us today. You are here because a number of people who view our show requested you.
Oh,
graciously consented to be here. You're here by popular demand. Thank you so much.
All right.
Nice to hear you. Thank you.
Well, let me introduce Dr. McCoy. Dr. Alfred McCoy is currently the Fred Harvey Harrington Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He specializes in the history of the Philippines, foreign policy of the United States, European colonialization of Southeast Asia, illegal drug trade, and Central Intelligence Agency covered operations. The CIA, as a matter of fact, attempted to block the publication of his first book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. He is also the author of Policing America's Empire, the United States and the Philippines, and the Rise of the Surveillance State. The other book is In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power. And his latest book is To Govern the Globe, World Order and Catastrophic Change. Welcome, Dr. McCoy. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me on.
So, I'd like to start with one thing. I'd like to begin with one thing. In your book, In the Shadow of the American Century, you wrote in your wonderful book with Hartford Mackinder and why he is so important in terms of explaining our past. And I think you will agree with me as well that it is explaining also the 3 or 4 decades that are to come forward. If you are to take this into consideration, Dr. McCoy, with what's going on the global stage, how would you assess this?
Sure. First of all, let's explain who Sir Alfred Mackinder was and what his big idea was. He was a British geographer who became enormously famous in his era, and he was catapulted from obscurity to fame by the publication of a single article in the Royal Geographical Journal in London in 1904. And what he argued was that the epicenter of global power lay in 3 joined continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, that he called the world island. And in support of his argument, he kind of redrew the map. Now, most Americans, when they grow up and they're sitting in an elementary or high school classroom in their social studies classes, they look up and they see a map of the world. And at the center of the map of the world is North America and South America. And then there's this funny way that Eurasia is kind of split in half and looks like these sort of blobs on either side, right? This is very much the America-centric perspective of the globe. But the kind of map that Mackinder drew was the antithesis, the exact opposite. He drew the map of the world that showed these 3 joined continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, as a single, almost a single landmass, which he called the world island. And his rendering of the globe, there were then these outlying and inconsequential little islands like Greenland and Iceland and North America and South America and Australia. And when I was doing my current book, To Govern the Globe, which sweeps across 600 years of world history,
Wow.
I studied the succession of the dominant, the hegemonic European powers, from Portugal to Spain, Holland, Britain, the United States, and now as an emerging power, China. And over the span of 600 years, with enormous differences in culture and technology and values, there was one thing that each of these powers shared. All of them rested their global hegemony on control over the Eurasian landmass. And in various ways and techniques, each of them struggled to do this. And to bring it up to date, okay, and I don't think most Americans are aware of the actual geopolitical strategy that the United States pursued during the 4 decades of the Cold War, and that were synonymous with America's rise to global power. That power rested not only on the fact that at the end of World War II, we had the world's most powerful military and controlled about half the world's economy, but we were the first power in 1,000 years that controlled the axial ends of Eurasia. As a result of the 1949 NATO pact, we had an anchor at the western anchor of Eurasia. And then 2 years later, in 1951, we signed 4 bilateral mutual defense pacts with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia that gave us an anchor along the eastern axis of Eurasia. And then we overlaid on top of that rings of steel, the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean, the 7th Fleet in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, air bases, and then in the most recent edition, 60 drone bases stretching from Sicily to Guam. And that was much of the source of US power during the Cold War, which was our capacity through these axial ends to dominate Eurasia and contain Russia and China behind the Iron Curtain, right? And now much of the tension between the United States and China lies in China's attempt to break America's control, America's dominance over Eurasia. And China's success in doing that through military and, most importantly, investment in infrastructure, China's success in doing that is ultimately, I think, bringing the end of U.S. world power by the end of this decade, by 2030.
Wow. Yeah. Well, actually, that is what I read in your last book you wrote, and I quote here: "If we focus on the last 5 centuries, New World Order seems to arise when a maelstrom of death or destruction coincide with some slower yet deeper social transformation to sweep away the old order. Since the start of the age of exploration in the 15th century, some 90 empires, major and minor, have come and gone in those same 500 years. However, there have been just 3 world order, all arising in the West: the Iberian Age after 1494, the British Imperial era from 1815, and the Washington World System from 1945 to perhaps something like 2030. Each transition to a new world order has occurred when a massively destructive cataclysmic has coincided with major social change." And then you're right, the rise of the Iberian Age of exploration was preceded by a century of epidemics known as the Black Death. End of quote. When you wrote this one, Dr. McCoy, is this a reflection? I know this is like you're reflecting what took place a few centuries. Do you see the current trend that is taking place right now reflective of this?
Oh, yes, very much so. First of all, the geopolitical change is, I think, occasioned by the rise of Chinese power, their investment of $1 trillion in building an infrastructure of pipelines, roads, and rails across the 6,000-mile breadth of the Eurasian landmass. Okay, that fundamental rise of China, their emergence by the end of this decade as the world's preeminent economic power, with an economy that's going to be about 50% larger than the American economy by the end of the decade. So that's the political change. But then, and that's long term. That's been going on now since, well, really most immediately since China joined the World Trade Organization as an economic equal to the West in 2001. So it's been about 20 years in the germ. But the cataclysm that we're facing, that is also adding pressure and producing this change, is climate change. And one of the things I tried to do in the book was to take the rather complex, very technical environmental science on climate change, and unlike almost any other scientific discipline, okay, which are focused on the present, on an immediate problem. Maybe economists go out 5 years, something like that. That would be medium-term forecasting for economists. But what climate change scientists are trying to do is they're trying to track the trajectory of climate change for the rest of the 21st century. And all of their publications that deal with these projections have high probability, medium probability, and low probability, subject to various conditions that they lay out. But they're all engaged in this science of prognostication, of prediction, and they're unique in that way. So what I tried to do was to take this long-term trajectory laid out by these climate scientists, and then read their conditions and come to a sort of a mid-range assessment of probability, and then lay on top of that the political trajectory of global power to see how the two might coincide. And so the Washington's World Order, which was established in World War II, was grounded in a rule of law, and it was founded on two fundamental principles enshrined in the United Nations and its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United Nations formed in 1945, the Universal Declaration 3 years later. And this was the idea of every human being has human rights, and every human being should, or every human community should live in a sovereign nation, and that nation should have inviolable sovereignty. And then from that proceeded literally hundreds of organizations and complex treaties, very legalistic in their way, but all founded in an underlying and really kind of an unspoken principle of global cooperation. This entire system, all these treaties, all these agreements, they don't work unless the nations of the world agree to participate and to cooperate fully within it. And some do and don't, more or less, but that's the underlying thing. Well, with climate change unleashing ever-rising torrent of refugees, what we've seen is a breakdown of this cooperation, the rise of hyper-nationalism, ultra-nationalism, manifest in, let's say, Britain's Brexit from the Brexit from the European Union, the rise of hyper-nationalism within the European Union. They're right now talking about ending the right of free movement within the European Union and allowing nations to re-erect customs immigration barriers that they wiped away. And then we also saw the rise of Donald Trump and his cry of build the wall. And when you think about this, okay, so when you add up the pressures, okay, what was this caused by? Middle Easterners coming through Turkey into the Greek islands. Sub-Saharan Africans crossing the Sahara and then the Mediterranean into Europe, and then Central Americans and some Mexicans, but mainly Central Americans, okay? And all of these people, to varying degrees, climate change refugees, are turning up at the southern border of the European Union and the United States. And when you add up all these people, the Middle Easterners, the Africans, and the Central Americans, between 2016 and 2018, it's only 2 million people. Okay, now, this climate change literature and studies by the World Bank and by the UN are saying that by 2050, in 30 years, that there are going to be, in some accounts, over 200 million climate change refugees. The most recent statistic is estimated to be, wait for the more recent statistic. The most recent statistic is 1.2 billion climate change refugees. Now, these are not economic refugees, which is, there's oftentimes people say, oh, they're economic refugees, and, send them back. These are people that are going to be uprooted from pummeled seashores, aridifying desert fringe, from dangerous floodplains. They're going to be literally moving to survive. This is going to be an unstoppable human tide. And it's not just going to happen in 2050 overnight. What we're seeing now is going to build up as climate change grows incrementally, okay? This tide is going to grow to those mind-boggling numbers. And as that happens, the cooperation of the American world order, the Washington world order, that underlying principle, is going to fade as people retreat behind their national boundaries and erect barriers to keep this human tide out. And so that is going to, I think, lead to China not only becoming the world's preeminent economic power by 2030, but in the years following, China's kind of, what might say, rational, commercial, non-idealistic, non-judgmental relations among nations, a kind of cash and carry internationalism.
Right.
That China's mutual national self-interest as the guiding principle of their emerging world order. That's likely to move into the ascent. And the human rights, the national sovereignty, the rule of law, all of that has been the foundation of the Washington world order, the culmination of 500 years of painful change, that's likely to be eclipsed in this change.
That's interesting.
When did you first recognize that the United States was in a state of decline?
Actually, yeah, about 20 years ago.
Okay.
At the moment when, around 2001, 2002, when the United States seemed to be the world's unchallenged superpower, in which there was this incredible hubris, imperial hubris, sweeping the United States, this kind of celebration of our power, our triumph. We defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There was no peer rival anywhere on the planet. We rebuilt the world in our recent economic image. During the 1990s, we broke down every vestige of socialism or state intervention in the economy in a kind of powerful 1-2 punch. U.S. financial institutions and international financial institutions, pushed open economies and free market principles and neoconservative ideals around the world. And so labor unions and protective customs and national entrepreneurs and all that rhetoric, that went aside, and we suddenly had neoliberalism triumphant. And, it was supposed to be, the phrase was the end of history. The whole world was going to become liberal, democratic, and capitalistic. Our world system would sweep away the process of change. It'd be entrenched for all time, for the foreseeable future. Okay, well, as a student of imperial history, I knew that no system is forever, and such beliefs are often the seeds of decline and change. And so I got together with 140 historians from 4 continents around the world, and we started an Empires in Transition project. And our first task was, America was the most powerful empire in human history, but the least studied, because during the Cold War, imperialism was something that the Soviets used to attack the United States. And so we were the exceptional nation that had power, global power, without the curse of empire. Okay, so since we weren't an empire, it was believed, Americans didn't study imperialism. So we were the most powerful and the least studied empire in human history. So the first task was to understand the nature of the U.S. hegemony. What were the attributes of it? And then to compare that to preceding European empires and look for the signs of change. So, by 2010, it was pretty clear that the U.S. was on a decline trajectory. And by 2012, 2014, it was clear that China was going to be the challenger that would turn that potential into a reality. And it was, in retrospect, and that's what historians are best at.
Yeah.
Once it's over, historians will tell you not only what happened, but why it happened just that way. Okay, so so now that it's over, okay, people are looking back, and what we recognize is that America's decline was actually a bipartisan project. Okay, the first thing was we were so arrogant, so filled with imperial hubris of the kind I described, that both parties in Washington, D.C. decided that China should join the World Trade Organization as an equal. Now, up to this time, the major players in open exchange had been industrial countries. So in effect, we trade Boeing jets for Germany's cars and that sort of thing. Okay, German machine tools for American aircraft engines. Okay, so people swap, and the theory is, of course, economic theory is that on comparative advantage, everybody gets more prosperous.
Right.
But what happens when 20% of the world's population joins the World Trade Organization? Initially, Americans were so confident that everybody felt that China would become a liberal democracy and a capitalist society, and that they would be good little boys and girls and join the world system and play by our rules. And China seemed to be that way until about 2013, 2014, when, after increasing their trade with the United States fivefold, they accumulated $4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, which was unprecedented.
Wow.
And in 2013, as this great fund of money was building up in China, Xi Jinping stood up in Kazakhstan and gave a speech in which he announced something called the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
And said that China was going to facilitate the construction of a single market through infrastructure that would stretch from the Atlantic and the Baltic Sea all the way to the South China Sea, across the 6,000 miles of the Eurasian landmass, bringing these two seemingly separate but actually single continents together into the greatest market in the world with 3 billion people. And indeed, that's what they've done. They've promoted that program. They are on track by about 2025, 26, 27 in there to expend something like $1 trillion in laying down this massive infrastructure of pipelines and rails and roads across the breadth of Eurasia. And then, and this is really interesting, then ringing the world island of the coast of Asia and Africa and Europe with 40 Chinese-built ports. And in my book, I have a map of what I call China's World Island Strategy 2020, showing those ports. And if you go to the earlier map of Portugal's ports in Africa and Asia in 1570, it's surprisingly, you could almost lay them one on top of the other, and they'd be not quite the same, but pretty close. Okay, so that's China's strategy, and it's got two dynamics in terms of world power. First of all, China knows that Eurasia is home to 70% of the world's population and productivity. So if you build this infrastructure, and commerce and profits flow towards Beijing, then global power will, as almost if by a natural law, one of them, you might say Sir Alfred Mackinder's law, it will flow naturally towards Beijing. Okay, and then the second thing that Beijing had to do was it had to break those circles of steel that the United States had laid around Eurasia with those two axial points of control, NATO in Europe and the mutual defense pacts in Asia, and then the circles of steel, now the 6th, 5th, and 7th fleets of the U.S. Navy. They had to break those circles of steel. So China has built 7 military bases in the South China Sea. It's expanded its Navy and its defense force enormously, and they're pushing at the United States very hard to push them back from what China calls the first island chain, which is Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines, down to Australia, push them beyond the first island chain. Okay, we call that the Pacific Littoral. That was our axial point for both defending the Pacific and North America and projecting our power onto Eurasia. And so if they can push us back, they can break that axial point of control. In fact, let's go to perhaps Sir Alfred Mackinder's greatest student was Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was the national security advisor to President Carter. And he studied Mackinder very carefully. And, geopolitics, it seems simple, okay? And it's a term that's kicked around all the time. I mean, you guys have a program with it in its name. But what surprises me is how very few people at the highest levels of power understand it and can really use it. Okay.
Yes.
True.
Okay. And Brzezinski was a guy that not only read Mackinder, but he figured out a way to do it. And so his great move, of course, was when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, he persuaded President Carter to fund a $100 billion CIA program, essentially to mobilize radical Islam and drive it like a spear into what Mackinder called the pivot region of Central Asia. Okay. And Mackinder's favorite axiom, or he also called it the heartland. He said, who controls the pivot region controls the world island, and who controls the world island controls the world. Okay. That was Mackinder's famous axiom that he came to after 20 decades of playing with these ideas. So Brzezinski drove radical Islam into Soviet Central Asia. And as a Polish emigre aristocrat, his real concern was Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe fell free, 3,000 miles to the west. It was a brilliant geopolitical move. And then, and of course, it had its consequences, mobilizing radical Islam. Yet, of course, Osama bin Laden, 9/11, all that. And in 1998, 3 years before 9/11 attacks, Brzezinski famously said in defense of his strategy, what's more important in the history of the world, the liberation of Eastern Europe or a few stirred up Muslims? This is phrase. But anyway, but then in retirement, Brzezinski actually became, I think, a pretty sophisticated observer. And he said, look, this was in the 1990s when America was in this moment of imperial hubris, the sole superpower, this belief that on the end of history that we were going to remake the world in our image and it would last for all times. Okay. So we're in this moment, and Brzezinski, again, said, maybe, but three things have to happen for American political power, American geopolitical power to be preserved. One, we have to maintain our position in Western Europe, by which he meant NATO. We have to prevent any single power from dominating the central part of Eurasia, Central Asia. And third, we have to maintain our bases along the Pacific Littoral. And if you think about it right now, look, China's consolidated control over Central Asia. Europe, thanks to Europe's own trajectory and the bad diplomacy, the attack that President Trump made repeatedly upon Europe. Europe is now talking about developing a European defense force and moving in a direction of geopolitical. Yep. So, Europe is going increasingly its own way. So we're losing that axial end. And as China draws Asia ever deeper into its economic matrix through things like the biggest trade pact in human history, the Regional Economic Cooperation Program, that gradually, I think the support for U.S. bases in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia potentially could wane, and we could get pushed back. So, America's greatest master of geopolitics, arguably, Zbigniew Brzezinski, made three conditions for the perpetuation of U.S. global power, and it looks like all three are being broken.
Wow. Well, that's an interesting point, Dr. McCoy. That leads me to tackle the, I'm sure you're familiar with the Thucydides trap theory. So are we going to be seeing that emerging soon between China and the United States? Will it ever happen?
Yeah. Well,
I am personally concerned. As a geopolitical analyst myself. I am concerned in the idea of how the United States, the West for that matter, ratcheting up tensions regarding the Taiwan Strait when we sort of signed the treaty, signed the papers, acknowledged the one China policy. And this leads me to think in terms of, okay, if we keep pushing to the point of no return, will the Thucydides trap theory per se becomes the reality of the day?
Yeah, what you're asking is, in essence, what's the likelihood of China and the United States going to war, particularly over Taiwan?
Yeah.
Look, the Chinese strategy, like the strategy of all imperial powers, is to push relentlessly. Most people, when they think of naval power, they think in terms of major battles: Lepanto, Trafalgar, Jutland, Leyte Gulf, Philippine Sea. These historic battles between navies, but that's not the main use of navies in building empires. I like to think of navies as conducting incessant patrolling that weaves a kind of cat's cradle of invisible traces across the global commons called the ocean, and turns this common space into private space. You might say, give me an example. I'd say, okay, the Pacific Ocean from 1945 up to about 2016, when China finished building its 7 bases in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. And China began really expanding its navy. All right, so China is just pushing relentlessly, avoiding a confrontation. I mean, you look at the way they built those islands. They made no announcements, no provocations. They just began doing it, and they quietly insisted that this is our territory. There's this 9-dash line that the People's Republic of China drew right after its formation in 1949, laying claim to virtually the whole of the South China Sea. Okay, and so they're not pushing for confrontation. They're just pushing relentlessly using this technique.
Yeah.
They're doing it in the East China Sea with Japan. Hundreds of air flights, challenging the Japanese airspace over a few islands in the East China Sea. So China's pushing relentlessly, pushing away to make these waters in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, essentially the whole first island chain from Japan down the Philippines, their waters. And the question is, and doing it in a way that eventually will lead to, from their perspective, Taiwan simply falling within their grasp. They did the kind of the same thing with Afghanistan, this summer.
Yeah.
Okay, the Chinese had no soldiers, no diplomats, no intervention. They just sat down and they wove a geopolitical network of rails in the east through Pakistan and pipelines in the north through Central Asia, and then signed a multi-billion-dollar trade agreement with Iran in March, and they thus surrounded Afghanistan with this grid. And then in July, the month before they took power, the Taliban sent a top-ranking delegation to meet with the Chinese foreign minister, and they agreed that China would help the Taliban develop Afghanistan. There's $1 trillion in minerals, rare earth minerals, very important for solar energy storage, solar batteries that Afghanistan has, and a critical pipeline access from Central Asia to the energy-starved region of South Asia. So that's China's style. Just envelop.
Well, it's clear who won the Afghan war then.
So if there's going to be a push, I would expect it might come more from the United States side. And with each passing year, our ability to fight a successful war in the Taiwan Straits is coming to an end. In 2019, the New York Times reported that the Pentagon had war-gamed a war between the United States and China over Taiwan 18 times, and the United States lost 18 times.
That's correct.
There's a very simple fact. Taiwan's 100 miles from China, and it's over 6,000 miles from the United States, nearly 7,000 miles from the United States. And it's 7,000 miles of open ocean, essentially. And so China's advantage is enormous. And China is already, China's military parity, which will be marked by not just equality with U.S. forces in a number of areas, but actual, we'll have superiority in some areas, and China will have superiority in others. And China's been very strategic in picking its superiority. Its anti-missile defenses are the most sophisticated in the world. Its carrier-killing missiles are some of the best. And as the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff testified not long ago, China has now taken a leap in the area of hypersonic missiles. These are missiles that fly at 3,000 to 5,000 miles an hour. And I've had discussions with military officers, Air Force officers, and I've asked them, private discussions, you know, is there anything in our defenses that could stop a hypersonic missile? Nothing. Nothing can stop a hypersonic missile.
Wow.
And you know, we've tried, and we did it for a while, and then we gave it up. The problem is, of course, when you're flying at 3,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, you know, the missile melts, right? So you have to. It's very sophisticated technology. It looks like China is making strides, and their satellite communications, which are critical, their satellite communications are now secure. We still use microwave communications. The Chinese use basically a kind of light beam communications with their satellites. You know, they've taken the leap in that areas as well. And so China's been very strategic. So if a war were to come by the end of this decade, there'd be no question, you know, China would win. You might say, well, we have a dozen, you know, of these massive aircraft carriers. All I can say is bigger boats are just bigger targets.
Right.
I mean, you know, the first thing that would happen, okay, is we'd mobilize 2 or 3 aircraft carriers somewhere in the Taiwan Straits. How would the world react if those aircraft carriers went down to the bottom of the Taiwan Straits? And they would. They would. There's no way that we could stop them. China's got, you know, thousands of missiles to block our missiles, so we can't take them out. And then they've got these carrier killer missiles, and they're getting ever more sophisticated. They would take them out.
Interesting.
And that would and people within the U.S. defense establishment, as they war game this, they understand this. China's military superiority grows apace. Okay, PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates that by 2030, China's economy will be 50% larger than the U.S. economy. The U.S. National Intelligence Council, which is the supreme analytic body in the U.S. intelligence community, has been saying since 2012 that by 2030, China would become the world's largest economy. And since roughly, over the long term, China and the U.S. spend respectively about 2 or 3% of their gross domestic product on defense. If China's economy is 50% bigger than America's, then its defense budget will be as well. And I would argue actually that China's command economy probably is more efficient at getting value for yuan or renminbi than our economy is, than the free market with the profit sector and, you know, the cost overruns and the well-documented inefficiencies in our military procurement system. So not only will China be spending more money, but I would argue that since it's integrated within a single command economy structure, they might get actually more bang for the buck. So by 2030, China is going to be not just a peer competitor, but in critical areas superior to the United States militarily. And if it's the war is not going to be fought, you know, off the coast of California. It's going to be fought, if it is to be fought, off the coast of China. And China's advantage in jet fighters and missiles and all the rest is just enormous. Just enormous. They have over 2,000 state-of-the-art jet fighters. You know,
do you have any concern about nuclear?
What?
Do you have any concern about this going nuclear?
Well, I first of all, I don't think it's going to happen. I think, you know, again, this whole strategy of just relentlessly pushing, but never pushing to the point of confrontation. And then by the time China pushes to the point where the United States decides something has to be done, or conservatives in Washington decide in a desperate moment that something has to be done, by that time, by the end of this decade, China's military power will be so overwhelming in the Taiwan Strait or in the first island chain that the United States won't do it. Just can't do it. I mean, you know, aircraft commanders, the chief of naval operations, simply say, if you send our ships into that range, they'll be gone. Do you really want to lose a couple of carriers? So, I don't think it's going to happen. I think China's relentless advance, avoiding confrontation, is going to eclipse the United States so thoroughly that by the time any possible confrontation comes, the United States, assuming rational voices obtain, and that's another question.
Pardon me for laughing. We're looking at how rational voices are making themselves known in Washington. Not right.
I mean, under a restored Trump administration or another hyper-nationalist regime, yeah, that could happen. Yes, there is a possibility, but I mean, that would take extraordinary circumstances for it to happen, and the results would simply, I think, by 2030, war off the coast of China would go so resolutely in China's favor that would just be the death knell for American power. It would be equivalent to 1956, the Suez Crisis. Britain was still a very considerable world power in 1956. They still had a fairly large empire. Their economy had rebuilt after the damages of World War II. They had a close alliance with the United States, which was the world's preeminent power. And they decided that when Nasser, the Egyptian president, nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, that Britain, France, and Israel decided they would take back the canal. And they sent 6 aircraft carriers. They destroyed the Egyptian Air Force. The Israelis smashed most of the Egyptian armor in the Sinai Peninsula. It was a stunning military victory, except for the geopolitics. Nasser was a smart man. He just realized all he had to do was take some rusting freighters, fill them with rocks, and sink them at the north end of the canal. And that cut Britain's pipeline to Asia. Moreover, it was such an outrageously imperialist act that the Eisenhower administration forced the British to withdraw. And Britain's pound was so weakened by the operation that the first IMF bailout was not for the Mexican peso, it was for the British pound, which just 10 years before had been the world's global reserve currency. It was a stunning blow. And again, it was completely irrational, motivated in this desperate act that somehow, that by seizing the canal, that the Britain's conservatives, these landed aristocrats that filled the cabinet of Sir Anthony Eden, that somehow they could recapture British imperial glory. It's known as micromilitarism. It's when the psychopathology of imperial decline, the pressures build up, the emotional and psychological and cultural pressures build up the point, reach a breaking point that dying empires lash out and launch one of these military adventures in a bid to recover glory through a stunning military blow. And they usually go badly. I mean, we could always have micromilitarism. That could happen.
In a way, are you seeing this happen today?
No, not right now.
The United States intervening in all the countries around China, attempting to block their progress?
If I had to describe micromilitarism to a declining U.S. power, I would say that it was the Afghan intervention and particularly the Iraq War. Okay, I mean, that was in many ways when I talked about earlier about the U.S. decline being a bipartisan project. One manifestation of it, of course, as I talked about earlier, was a mission of China to the World Trade Organization. The other manifestation was 2 decades of war in the wider Middle East.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, the neoconservatives that launched the United States into Iraq, who knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction. I mean, that was just a pretext for getting in there. They wanted to build this massive bastion in the Green Zone in Baghdad and insert the United States into the Middle East and remake the region, and more specifically, get an endless lien on oil. And it was a gross geopolitical miscalculation occurring just at the moment that oil was about to join cordwood and coal in the destiny. And you know what? We didn't even get it.
Yeah.
but still, that was the lot. I mean, if there was a logic to all that irrationality, so it was a combination of that grand design of securing the oil, but it was also, I think, in terms of the people that ran it, Cheney and Rumsfeld, they were. I think they had a micro-military mindset because they were in the Ford White House. Rumsfeld was chief of staff under Gerald Ford, and Dick Cheney was the sort of deputy chief of staff under Rumsfeld. And they were in the White House when Saigon fell. And there was that searing blow to American national pride, that searing defeat that still it is just etched into American political consciousness. The helicopters leaving from the roof of the embassy and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And so, in the Iraq invasion, I see an element of micromilitarism, attempt to recover a unilateral exercise of America as a superpower in this operation. And of course, it turned out extremely badly. It cost us something like $8 trillion and, ended in a humiliating withdrawal from Kabul with, again, helicopters leaving the embassy, much like they did in Saigon back in 75.
And that is one of the hardest time why the West is having a hard time accepting the shift into a multipolar system. The US used to be the dominant power, or at least a couple of decades ago, but this seems to be having a hard time accepting this reality. The seats at the geopolitical table have been rearranged, and they don't seem to like that one. I'd like to ask one more question, Dr. McCoy, if I may, before I let you go. And this one has to do with ASEAN countries. Where do you see ASEAN countries moving forward? Given the history over there, given the U.S. presence in certain parts, in Philippines, for example, Cambodia, Laos, and so forth, where do you see the trajectory going forward?
Yeah, ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is one of these regional organizations that emerged during the Cold War, in a way to as an alternative to the bipolar divide of communism versus capitalism, etc. And there's what used to be the Organization of African Unity, the Arab League, the Mercosur. There's a number of them right around the world. The European Union is the most successful of them. Okay, now the difference is that ASEAN is a much looser association. Its collaboration is much more voluntary. They haven't gone, for example, to shared customs, to free movement of personnel within the region. There's no discussion, no serious discussion of common defense on the part of ASEAN. So ASEAN is really among these regional organizations. It's strong in the sense of they move by consensus and they're able to move. But it's not an organization that's really heading to kind of a supranational organization with some real power and authority. So in effect, what China's been able to do, and what China prefers to do, as it does with every single nation in the world, is to deal with them bilaterally, to break them apart. Now, one of the problems that China faces with the ASEAN nations is that the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam all border the South China Sea, and the 9-dash line comes well within their 200-mile zone of the 200-mile exclusive economic zone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. All right, so China is breaking that pressure by dealing with them all bilaterally, trade and diplomacy. And China's been successful up to now in doing this. And it remains to be seen whether that's going to continue to work. But for the time being, let's work. So I see ASEAN increasingly integrated within China's expanding economic sphere through the Regional Economic Cooperation Program, And then China, ironically, is applying to become a member of the revived Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama launched to check China. Then Trump withdrew it. Now China is actually trying to get a membership. And so China is kind of creating regional economic blocks that transcend ASEAN and thus, if you will, in a sense, supplant it. I think China relationship with its neighbors, indeed, China's a world power. China's a global hegemon. We'll be able to do this assuming they become the hegemon by 2030. Mm-hmm. I think this is something I explain in the book, To Govern the Globe. I don't think they're going to last longer than about 20 or 30 years as a global hegemon. And again, if you look at the projections, and they're pretty clear, and I'd say they have a high probability of accuracy. There are clear projections that among the world's major industrial powers, China is going to be the most adversely affected by climate change. Well, first of all, its greatest city, Shanghai, which is home to 18 million people, and it was one of its main economic engines. Plus, the Guangzhou in southern China, which is another huge economic engine for much of the export economy is located there. But let's take Shanghai. Shanghai was dredged from swamp and sea back in the 15th century. And the projections are that by 2050, the sea level rise will mean that most of Shanghai, including much of its downtown area, is going to be underwater. Okay, Shanghai is going to be essentially gone. All right, and then another very clear projection is, global warming, actually, as it accelerates, is going to produce some major global hotspots, and the least habitable place on the planet, which is now a major source of human habitation, is going to be the North China Plain, which is an area between Shanghai and Beijing, currently home to about 400 million people, and is in many ways the historic heartland of China, its agricultural heartland, much of its industry. Yeah. And by 2060, 2070, based on climate projections, there are going to be hundreds of extreme weather events. And during this period, China is going to start to face projected five periods of what's called 35-degree wet bulb temperature, 35 degrees centigrade wet bulb temperature. Now, what is that? That is when the balance of heat and humidity is such that the human body can't sweat. So a healthy adult seated at rest under 35-degree wet bulb temperature will be dead in 6 hours. So China's North China Plain is going to have 5 periods in which, if people leave air conditioning, they will be dead. Okay, and so the combination of sea level rise battering the China coast and serious temperature rise, rendering the North China Plain one of the least habitable places on the planet, will mean that China will have to retreat from whatever world order, whatever kind of diplomacy and forced projection it's engaged in, and it's going to have to turn those resources into protecting its own people and adapting to climate change. And I think that will end the Chinese world order. And that faces the world with, for the first time, really since 1494, there will be no world order. And because China is not only trying to replace the United States as a global hegemon, but it's also trying to construct an alternative world order. We talked about that earlier. So that in my view, means that the world is going to face some very real choices. One, collapse into disorder, which is going to be an unimaginable amount of localized violence. Just think of all the places where water wars might be fought.
Yeah.
Where people are going to be pushing back those 200 million to 1.2 billion people that are moving to survive. The disorder would be literally catastrophic. Wow. Okay, so an empowered, let's say, UN, which, if it's the UN, would have to conduct some reforms, make the the Security Council and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. I mean, it's a travesty that Britain has a seat, but India doesn't have one. I mean, really?
Yeah.
And Britain India by 2050 is going to be maybe the 2nd largest economy in the world by current projections. So, and plus a major global power. Okay, so a reformed Security Council, and thus this body reform would need to have actual sovereignty, power over 3 very small but critical areas of the national sovereignty over the world. First of all, they would need to regard emissions, if any, and there are going to be greenhouse gas emissions in 2050. India, to mention India, has committed itself to carbon neutrality by 2070. So clearly, India, as it grows, is going to be making major emissions. So that will have to stop. That will be, I think, have to be regarded as equivalent to invading a sovereign state today with armed force. Okay, so that would be one mandate. Second, there's going to have to be an office of an empowered UN High Commissioner for Refugees. That the current process of settlement of refugees, which is voluntary, would have to become mandatory. We'd have to regard this planet as something of a lifeboat, and we're pulling people from the sea, not moving for economic convenience or aspiration, but moving for simple survival. And then, third and finally, that the voluntary contributions of capital that we saw at Glasgow in the COP26 UN Conference on Climate Change, and you know, the rich nations promised $100 billion, I think, going back several years, and they haven't even paid that. Those voluntary contributions would have to become mandatory in order for climate change remediation to allow people to literally shelter in place in their native countries, and also to provide food aid and support for climate change damage remediation and for food relief. And those three reforms to construct an empowered world order, like one we've never seen, although they're very small reforms, they might be able in some way to cope with this coming climate crisis.
Very interesting. Anything to add, Russ, before?
You know, I'm grateful to the people who requested you by name. This has been a fascinating revelation to me. I can hardly talk about how much this information, the world needs to know this. Indeed. And they need to know it now.
Indeed. Well, for our viewers, I'm sure they'll find Dr. McCoy's insights very, very, very informative. So, Dr. McCoy, if people wants to get a hold of your books and all, where do they need to go? Where do they need to go?
It's right there on Amazon.com.
Okay.
If they have a local bookseller, then, you know.
Okay.
Hopefully
we'll make sure we put, if it is on Amazon, we'll put a link on the description to your books over in our description.
Right.
We'll post this one for you. So, well, we want to thank you so much, Dr. McCoy, for carving out time for us. It was such a treat.
Absolutely.
Such a treat. And we look forward to having you once again on our show.
Thank you very much.
Viewers, we want to say, hope you enjoyed Dr. McCoy's insights here. They are very, very, you won't get them anywhere else. This is why we were very grateful to Dr. McCoy for carving out time for us. And to all of you, we say thank you for your support, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And as always, stay informed. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.